So we are next to better understand commercial fisheries risk, behaviors, and fishery dynamics.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm Bobby Murphy. I'm a postdoc over at Alaska Pacific University, where I run the Human Dimensions program. So I'm going to change things up here a bit and send us to the West Coast. So while today I'm going to be primarily talking about some work that I've been doing out in Alaska and the North Pacific more generally. I did my PhD at Northeastern University in Boston and actually still live up 30 minutes from Boston. And a lot of the work I've been doing for my postdoc is really trying to ask these bigger, large-scale questions that I hope to tie into some future work that we're just beginning in New England. So I'll touch on some of those ties at the end of my talk. So, as I said, I run the Human Dimensions program at Alaska Pacific University. So, I'm primarily interested in understanding or better understanding the way that fishery stakeholders are sort of intertwined in the way that we manage fish and natural resources, actually, more generally. And lucky for me, this is mandated by law. Magnuson-Stevens dictates that we at least attempt to understand the implications of management actions on stakeholder communities and to ultimately minimize those adverse impacts to fishery stakeholders. But we've known over the last couple of decades, especially, that failing to consider stakeholder perspectives can really lead to some profound unintended consequences. So whether or not it's by necessity or just out of doing a better job holistically managing these systems, it's important that we work with fishermen to better understand their perspectives. So Alaska, I think, is in large parts leading the way in finding new strategies for systematically incorporating fishermen perspectives. For example, in 2018, at least federally, the North Pacific Fishery Management Council adopted what's called the Bering Sea Fishery Ecosystem Plan. And this FEP, its primary purpose is to assess the trade-offs between environmental, economic, and social costs and benefits of making management decisions. So to do this, in theory, they're supposed to be using a lot of social science and human dimensions. So incorporating the local and traditional knowledge of stakeholders. This is going to include both commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, and also Alaska natives, so subsistence fishers, related to the form of traditional knowledge. I'm a member on the Local Traditional Knowledge Task Force, which is formed by the Council. It's an external body of scientific experts and knowledge holders to begin making recommendations for systematically including stakeholder perspectives. Now, this is outside of just public testimonies. It's developing new protocols for doing this. But one of the challenges that we're running into, especially with commercial fisheries, specifically some large-scale commercial fisheries in the North Pacific, is that there's a really long history of distrust between fishermen and some management agencies, but also fishermen and previous social science efforts. This is in large part due to researchers coming in, conducting surveys, publishing results, and really not reaching back out to those stakeholder bodies. And it's often left the fishermen sort of wondering how they came to the conclusions that they came to and feeling that work really misrepresented their fisheries. Today I'm going to be going through 3 studies, kind of just touching on each of them, that they're separate, but it's really part of a programmatic line of inquiry that we're undertaking at Alaska Pacific that's really first founded in this idea that we need to work collaboratively with fishermen to really generate any sort of reliable information. So that first study that I'm going to be talking about is working with a large fishery in Alaska. That's the catcher-processor Bering Sea pollock fleet. That work then gets extended into case study 2 here, where we continued our work with the pollock fleet to conduct some cognitive mapping exercises to better understand the functioning of their social-ecological system. And finally, I'm going to be extending some of that work to do some comparisons between North Pacific and New England. So this first project, like I said, is with a commercial pollock fleet out in Alaska that primarily operates out of the Bering Sea. This video that I'm playing here is just some rolling film of one of those vessels operating. So this really epitomizes large-scale fishing. Some of these boats are upwards of 350 feet. They're catching many metric tons a day of pollock, and it's actually the largest fishery by volume in the United States, and I believe the second largest by volume in the world. So they're really catching a lot of fish. And the challenge here is there's not that many boats, and there's not that many companies, but they fish a lot and they have a pretty substantial impact. So what we try to do is begin developing a collaboration so we can better understand the trade-offs of making alternate management decisions, similar to the last presentation about management strategy evaluation. It's all about trade-offs. The first thing we did was worked with these fishermen. We actually developed a collaboration with their cooperative, so the collective entity that allocates quota once received from the federal government. It helps allocate that quota to the fishing companies and fishing vessels of that cooperative. We worked iteratively with them over the course of a couple years, actually, which finally led to a survey that was really just trying to generate a baseline of information for what types of things they were concerned about, whether it be environmental concerns or regulatory concerns, just trying to generate at least a method for beginning to understand these things. So we asked about a variety of scenarios, both regulatory and environmental, and we simply asked people, pretty straightforward, how beneficial or costly would these scenarios be to their business if it was to happen in the next couple of years. So these included things like changes in bycatch regulations. So their primary bycatch species there, which is termed prohibited species catch, or PSC, is Chinook salmon. So they catch it incidentally and have a hard cap on how much Chinook salmon they're allowed to catch before there's either pretty high penalties or fishing can eventually stop. We also asked about the opening and closing of current closed areas, and some environmental scenarios that we asked were things like increases or decreases in sea ice coverage, shifting amounts of cold bottom water, etc. What we found was something pretty interesting. We saw a pretty large range of responses. Some things that were really positively perceived were, not surprisingly, the opening of some closed areas. For example, a closed area known as the catcher vessel operational area, and another for stellar sea lions. But also, increasing size and average pollock was perceived to be highly beneficial, potentially not surprisingly either. On the other hand, we saw some really costly scenarios, such as the implementation of new bycatch species, so new hard caps for prohibited species catch. And then in the middle of this are some environmental scenarios, like changing sea ice coverage, which there's really a lot of responses across the board. There wasn't really a collective answer there that we felt was perceived by the pollock fleet. But after sort of assessing these really broad perspectives, we then drilled down on each of those hypothetical scenarios and asked people to indicate whether or not this suite of changes could occur. So these plots, I'm just going to show you a couple here, just shows the proportion of individuals or respondents from our survey that selected each of these changes would occur under all of these, or under each of these specific scenarios. So here I'm showing a decrease in the allocation of Chinook salmon prohibited species catch, so a more restrictive bycatch regulation. And we see that this could result in a number of things. For one, almost everybody that we surveyed in the fleet believed that this would lead to increased fuel usage, potentially because of longer fishing trips, trying to avoid salmon and find pollock. They believe they had to conduct more test tows, just putting your trawl gear in the water, doing a short tow to see what's underwater to make sure you're not catching too much bycatch. They believe this would lead to increased searching, so searching more for your target species, and ultimately what they care most about is decreasing profit. So if the Chinook salmon PSC was to go down, they believe ultimately this would lead to decreased
9 minutes.
Thank you. But alternatively, when we looked at things like shifting distribution of pollock, so in the North Pacific, we're seeing a lot of species, pollock in particular, moving further northwest in the Bering Sea, which is further from where they're offloading their fish, a lot of times in Dutch Harbor and actually out of Seattle as well. So we're seeing there that people believe there's going to be increased fuel usage, longer fishing trips, more time searching for their target fish, not surprisingly, and fishing further from their offload port. Okay, so I'm going to move quickly here into the second part of this project, where we really wanted to extend that first survey. Like I said, it was really basic, just trying to get a baseline for sort of how they perceive various risks. The The second part of that was now going to dig into sort of the magnitude and shape of those relationships between environmental factors and regulatory factors. We brought people together, a pretty small group of people in those fleets. So this was really high up individuals, some skippers and some like CEOs of these companies that own a number of boats. We brought them together in a focus group setting, and then we eventually tried to get everyone's individual perspective on a survey that we launched as well. And the primary method that we used here has been used for a number of years and is becoming more popular. This is the idea of cognitive mapping. A simple, kind of silly example I usually give to explain this concept is if you think about how much coffee you drink in a day, I could tell you that my coffee consumption is definitely dictated by how much sleep I got the night before, also dictated by how much I'm working, and probably how much I'm stressed. So ultimately, all of these things are probably interrelated, right? The number of hours that I'm working is related to how much I'm sleeping and so on. We can take this a step further and try to apply these sort of fuzzy, semi-quantitative parameters to these relationships. Although this does assume that these relationships are linear. So I'm going to get to that in a minute. We started this cognitive mapping exercise with the factors that people deemed to be important in the previous survey. So looking at things like pollock recovery rates. So how much of an individual fish are you actually retaining in value to sell versus just waste product. We looked at trip length, the time spent fishing versus the time spent searching for pollock. And we looked at how these things potentially impact CPUE, so catch per unit effort. And I know this is a pretty busy figure here, but this is the result of that cognitive mapping session, and it really just shows the really extensive complexity of this system, which I'm sure would be similar to many commercial fisheries if we were to do similar exercises. Some of the more interesting findings are that things like Chinook salmon, prohibited species catch, was really integrally linked to a lot of this system. So, for example, if we saw Chinook salmon PSC limits going down, so getting more restrictive, people believe this would lead to directly more time searching for pollock. But then this would also directly lead to more test tows and a longer length of fishing trips. And then to round it out, these two things would then lead to increased fuel usage, so having these greenhouse gas emissions through consequences. And if I could keep going with this and keep drawing connections between factors, sort of illustrating that these things are really intertwined, and if you pull on one string, a lot of these things are going to move. We also found that safety was influenced by a lot of factors, which was not necessarily surprising, but to me it's something that you don't hear talked about maybe as often as it should be, given that the way that we manage these fisheries, whether or not these fleets are rationalized or operating under some race to fish. You said 5 minutes?
Yes, 5 minutes.
Thank you. That these things really fundamentally affect safety, which I believe this figure really shows that we need to consider safety concerns in the future. What we did was then ask people on a survey to specifically tell us the degree to which their business would change under these various PSC limits, and we also focused on changes in pollock size. And to do this, we did an individual survey with the fishermen at the focus group. To orient each of these plots real quick, we asked about 6 different levels of each of these variables. So for Chinook salmon PSC, we asked about a 50% decline in PSC, a 25% decline, a 10% decline, and then the reverse, 10, 25, and 50% increases. We then asked people to select on a scale from an extreme increase to an extreme decrease, how this would affect a number of factors. So here I'm just showing you the results for trip length. And what we found is that at least for trip length, we see this really strong negative relationship, whereas PSC goes up, so getting closer to that 50% increase mark, we see a pretty extreme decrease in trip length. We can then look across the board for 10 different relationships that we explored. We found some pretty intriguing findings. For one, there were a number of variables that demonstrated a really strong positive relationship between at least pollock size and then the variable of interest, where there was really high consistency, or really high sort of confidence, if you will, between the different participants, which are shown in different colored lines here. We also saw a really strong negative relationship here, as I showed you for trip length. And really exciting, I think, that we found some nonlinear relationships too. For one, we found that profit was nonlinear and followed the third order polynomial, where the highest slope, or the steepest slope of this line occurred around zero, such that small tweaks on either end of this scale resulted in pretty dramatic perceived changes amongst the fleet. We also saw, for a number of factors, there was some uncertainty. There were a handful of individuals that sort of bucked the trend, if you will, and believed the contrary, at least compared to their peers in the pollock fleet. And this is something that we are currently talking with the fleet about to drill down why this potentially occurred. So to wrap up these two projects, we found that it's really critical to work from the ground up with these fishermen to develop collaborations, not just for short-term projects, but for the long term. We found that these regulatory and environmental changes can really fundamentally alter the way that these fishing companies operate, and that these impacts may not always be linear. For people that are interested in finding this work, we published the first of this set of studies in marine policy, and the second in review. I'm going to skip over that because I know I'm short on time here, but the third part of this is that we're extending this work into New England now. We just successfully received funding to the North Pacific Research Board for a grant for 2021-2022. We're going to be working with now 5 fleets, potentially more, 2 of which are in New England, so Gulf of Maine multi-species groundfish and the Northeast sea scallop fleet. And we're specifically going to be looking at this idea of adaptive capacity.
Minute 30.
First, we're going to be going to each of these fleets to understand the risks that they perceive, similar to how we did for the pollock fleet, and then trying to assess their ability to adapt and respond to those changes using some previously used indices, such as adaptive capacity and social capital indices that have been used by other of our colleagues in New England for a number of years. But the idea here is that we're really trying to look sort of cross-coast the potential implications of various regulatory strategies and how that really impacts the perceived risks that these fishermen are facing, or at least they believe they're facing, whether that be regulatory or environmental, and then how can they adapt to those changes in the future, and ultimately looking within those fleets to see if there's predictors or attributes of fishermen or fishing companies that can help us to understand who may survive into the future. So with that, I'll wrap up and be happy to take questions if I have time here.